At 8:21 a.m. on October 14, 1943, two 91 B-17 Flying Fortresses began their approach towards Schweinfurt, Germany, with fighter escorts planning to return home after less than an hour. The bombers were destined for Ball, bearing factories that were crucial to sustaining the German war effort. With no fighter protection for the last 400 miles of their journey, they would be vulnerable to intense attacks from the Luftwaffe without any air cover. The escorting fighters were P-47 Thunderbolts, considered the best available to the 8th Air Force. However, these aircraft could only provide support for about 175 miles before needing to return due to fuel constraints. Once past this point, the bombers would be defenseless. This scenario was not new. Just 2 months prior, on August 17th, 60 bombers were shot down in a single day, and 1 week earlier, on October 8th, another 30 planes fell victim to enemy fire over Bremen. The crews referred to these missions as suicide runs, knowing full well the risks involved. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men, most of whom never reached their 25th mission. Fear was not the issue. American bomber crews willingly faced daily dangers such as fighter planes, anti-aircraft fire, and extreme cold temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees Celsius. The problem lay in distance rather than courage or the resilience of the B-17 itself, which was well armored with 13.5 mm machine guns. Key German targets were located deep within the Reich, approximately 800 miles from England. No American fighter aircraft could sustain a fight at such distances. For example, the P-47 had a combat radius of only 175 miles, while even the extended range model of the P-38 Lightning, with drop tanks, reached just 300 miles, far short of Berlin's distance of 580 miles and the Ruhr Valley's distance of 400 miles. Each additional mile beyond the reach of fighter escorts resulted in more bombers being shot down and crews being killed or captured. The United States Army Air Forces had long held the belief that bombers could defend themselves. This doctrine stated that large formations of B-17s equipped with machine guns would generate such overwhelming defensive fire that enemy fighters couldn't penetrate their ranks. However, this theory was formulated by individuals who had never witnessed a Fock Wolf 190 diving at 400 mmF, its cannons firing relentlessly. It was crafted before anyone comprehended the reality of 100 German fighters attacking 40 bombers without any protection. On October 14th, P-47 escorts were forced to turn back near Aachen due to fuel exhaustion, leaving the bombers to continue their mission alone. The ensuing events would become known as Black Thursday. Out of the T-91 bombers that took off that morning, 60 were shot down, resulting in the loss of 600 lives and captures within just 5 hours. Another 17 aircraft returned with such severe damage they had to be scrapped, while an additional 121 suffered damage but could still be repaired. The 8th Air Force lost more than 20% of its attacking force in a single mission. At this pace, the entire bomber fleet would be obliterated after 5 missions. Strategic bombing operations were failing, and the war effort was facing a critical juncture. Meanwhile, sitting in a filing cabinet at Wright Field in Ohio was a report detailing a fighter plane that the Army Air Forces had neglected for 2 years. A plane capable of preventing Black Thursday entirely. This aircraft was called the P-51 Mustang. The tale of how it was initially ignored and nearly discarded before becoming the most crucial fighter of World War II does not begin with American generals or Pentagon officials, but rather with a British Purchasing Commission and North American Aviation's president, James Howard Kindleberger. In January 1940, Kindleberger headed North American Aviation, a company that had never produced a fighter plane. They primarily manufactured trainers like the AT-6 Texan, which were used to teach pilots how to fly. His company excelled at manufacturing, training aircraft, and consistently met contractual obligations. However, building fighters presented a different challenge altogether. Fighters demanded advanced engineering expertise, cutting-edge aerodynamics, and powerful engines capable of delivering optimal performance at high altitudes. North American aviation had no prior experience in this domain. Yet, when Sir Henry Self from the British Purchasing Commission visited Kindleberger's office in January 1940, he was not seeking innovation. Instead, he wanted Kindleberger to produce Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. With France having fallen and the Battle of Britain imminent, the Royal Air Force desperately needed aircraft that could fly and fight immediately. Although the P-40 was merely adequate, it could engage in combat at low altitudes but performed poorly above 15,000 feet due to its Allison engine's lack of supercharging for high-altitude performance. Britain required large numbers of planes rather than perfection. Upon hearing Self's request, Kindleberger countered with an offer that seemed preposterous. He claimed North America could design and construct a superior fighter from scratch within 120 days. A mere 4 months to go from concept to flying prototype. Self believed Kindleberger was either lying or out of his mind. Nobody could have imagined crafting a new fighter jet in such a short time frame. The British Purchasing Commission set an extremely tight deadline of 120 days for this task. If he didn't succeed, they would look elsewhere with their investment. What Self was unaware of was that Edgar Schmud, the chief designer at North American Aviation, had been working on a groundbreaking fighter design for several months already. Schmud, who immigrated to America in 1931 from Germany, was entirely self-taught and possessed an exceptional talent for aerodynamic efficiency. Born in 1899 in Hornbach, Germany, he served as an aircraft mechanic during World War I with the Austro-Hungarian Aviation Forces. Following the war, Schmud worked in Brazil for Fowler before moving to the United States. He joined North American Aviation in 1936 after a brief period at Belanca. Schmud had a distinctive approach to design, advocating that every part of an aircraft should serve multiple functions. Structural components could also act as aerodynamic surfaces, cooling ducts could generate thrust, and fuel tanks could double as structural elements. This integrated design philosophy would make the Mustang one of the most efficient fighters during World War II. For 2 years, Schmud had been developing a concept for a fighter with laminar flow wings, which promised to cut drag by 20%. He thoroughly analyzed the flaws in existing aircraft designs like the PP-40 and 39, as well as early Spitfires. He understood their shortcomings and knew precisely how to improve them. For instance, the P-40's radiator was suspended beneath the fuselage, creating significant drag, while the P-39's engine placement behind the cockpit led to balance issues. The elliptical wings of the Spitfire were aesthetically pleasing yet challenging to produce. Schmud aimed to circumvent these issues. By the time Kindleberger assured Britain of an upcoming new fighter aircraft, Schmud had already conceived his design and was ready to proceed with its construction. The obstacles ahead were both technical and organizational in nature. North American Aviation lacked experience in crafting fighters. Their engineers specialized in trainers and bombers rather than high-performance combat planes. Schmud needed to simultaneously educate his team on the principles of fighter aircraft design while adhering to a strict 120-day deadline. He brought together a dedicated group of engineers including Raymond Rice, Larry Waite, Ed Hawke and Art Chester. Rice focused on structural design, crafting an innovative multi-section fuselage that could be assembled efficiently. Waite oversaw systems integration, ensuring the flawless coordination of hydraulics, electronics, and control mechanisms. Hawke tackled aerodynamics, spending long hours with a slide rule to confirm that Schmud's intuitive designs were sound. Chester was responsible for designing the power plant installation, determining how best to mount the Allison engine for optimal balance and cooling. The team worked tirelessly, often putting in 18-hour days, 7 days a week. They ate at their workstations and slept in the factory. As Britain fought for its survival and France fell, these 5 men in California raced against time to build an entirely new fighter from scratch. The stakes were incredibly high. Failure could cost Britain the war, while success would yield something unprecedented. A mass-producible fighter that could match the performance of a thoroughbred racehorse. Their design was entirely unique and unmatched by anything else in the skies at the time. The wings featured laminar flow airfoils developed through collaboration with Naxia's predecessor, which allowed for a smoother airflow compared to conventional designs, significantly reducing drag. A groundbreaking cooling system for the engine was also introduced, rather than using external radiators that caused additional drag. Sheen placed the radiator inside the fuselage behind the cockpit. The heated air from this internal radiator not only cooled the engine but also generated thrust, effectively converting waste heat into propulsion. Every surface of the aircraft was meticulously calculated to minimize drag as much as possible. The fuselage was constructed using conic sections, a technique that resulted in perfectly smooth and aerodynamic surfaces. Designed with mass production in mind, the airframe was divided into 5 major components that could be built separately and assembled swiftly. After 78,000 man-hours of work, on September 9, 1940, the prototype emerged from the hangar, coming in ahead of schedule by a full 18 days. Designated as the ENA 73X, it was a striking aircraft even when stationary. Its sleek appearance suggested incredible speed. However, there was an initial setback. No engine had been installed due to delays from Allison with their V-1710. On October 26, 1940, test pilot Vance Breese took the ENA 73X for its maiden flight. The aircraft surpassed all performance bench effortlessly, achieving a top speed of 390 MUFAF, outpacing every American fighter in production at that time. It demonstrated stability and responsiveness, making it a pleasure to fly. Impressed by these capabilities, the British promptly ordered 320 units. They christened it the Mustang. Initial evaluations highlighted both the potential and drawbacks of the Mustang. The Laminina flow wing functioned precisely as Schmud had envisioned, ensuring steady airflow even at speeds that caused other aircraft to buffet and tremble. Critics who believed the radiator scoop would generate significant drag were surprised when it actually produced a minor thrust effect, just as Schmud had anticipated. This phenomenon was later named after British engineer Meredith, although he never managed to implement it successfully. However, issues also emerged. The Allison engine performed admirably at low altitudes but faltered above 15,000 feet due to its single-stage supercharger's inability to compress sufficient air. While Spitfires could engage effectively up to 25,000 feet, the Mustang's capabilities diminished beyond 15,000 feet. The British devised a solution, utilizing the Mustang for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions where speed and range were more critical than high-altitude performance. The first Mustangs arrived in Britain in October 1941, with No. 26 Squadron at Gatwick being the first to receive them. Initially skeptical, pilots soon changed their minds after experiencing its capabilities firsthand. Squadron leader Jeffrey Page famously remarked, "It was like stepping from a cart to a thoroughbred. The aircraft's speed, acceleration, stability, every aspect of it outshone its competitors." The RAF swiftly deployed Mustangs on rhubarb missions, conducting low-level raids over occupied France. Pilots flew just 50 feet above the English Channel to evade German radar, crossing into France at top speed, targeting airfields and trains, engaging truck convoys, before racing back home before enemy fighters could respond. These operations were perilous yet productive. They compelled the Germans to spread their fighter defenses thinly across the coast, weakening their overall strength. On May 10, 1942, Flying Officer Hollis Hills of No. 444 Squadron became the first Mustang pilot on a German aircraft, a Fokker 190 over France. By August, RAF Mustangs had accounted for 20 enemy planes destroyed, though these successes were overshadowed by what was yet to come. The true potential of the Mustang remained constrained by the limitations of its Allison engine. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army Air Forces showed little interest in the aircraft. When 2 prototypes arrived at Wright Field in 1941 for assessment, they languished on the tarmac with only 1 hour of testing completed. Other fighter projects, such as the P-47 from Republic and the P-38 from Lockheed, were receiving priority attention. Bell was manufacturing P-39s and Curtiss continued to produce P-40s. The Mustang was viewed as a British initiative funded by foreign investment and irrelevant to American requirements. When the evaluation report was eventually compiled, it acknowledged the plane's superior low-altitude performance, but pointed out its high-altitude limitations due to the single-stage supercharger of the Allison engine. Resistance at Wright Field was both bureaucratic and personal. Major General Oliver P. Echols, head of the Material Division, had already committed the Army Air Forces to the P-47 as their primary fighter. As Chief Procurement Officer for the entire Army Air Forces, Echols wielded significant influence over these decisions. His decisions dictated which aircraft were constructed, which engines were designed, and which weapons were fielded. He viewed the Mustang as an obstacle to established projects. The P-47 was entirely American, from its engine to its construction. The Mustang's British roots made it suspect in his eyes. Wright Field's test pilots submitted tepid reports on the Mustang, criticizing its cockpit design, gun placement, and fuel system. They found issues everywhere except with its outstanding performance compared to all contemporary American fighters. One pilot noted that handling the Mustang was like driving a truck relative to the P-40, though this observation held only at low speeds, irrelevant in combat where speed and acceleration were paramount. This bureaucratic resistance wasn't confined to Wright Field, it extended throughout the command structure. General Henry Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces, initially showed no interest in the Mustang. He prioritized heavy bombers, convinced that strategic bombing would secure victory. Fighters were viewed as defensive measures, essential but not pivotal. His staff mirrored his priorities by allocating resources primarily to bombers and their infrastructure, while fighters received secondary attention. Even after the British showcased the Mustang's potential with a long-range reconnaissance mission over Germany in July 1942, American officials remained unconvinced. Flying from England to Cologne and back, round trip of 800 miles, the Mustangs captured images of German facilities without suffering any losses, thereby demonstrating its range capabilities. Wright Field decided to purchase additional reconnaissance versions rather than fighter aircraft. The Army Air Forces did not order any Mustangs for combat purposes. Instead, they requested that 500 be converted into dive bombers and designated them as A-36 Apaches. Another 310 were ordered specifically for reconnaissance missions. However, the fighter version of this plane, which would later play a crucial role in saving the bomber offensive, was overlooked. While the Mustang went to war with the Royal Air Force, the United States Army Air Forces continued to suffer significant losses of bombers. The person who would eventually bring about significant changes was not a high-ranking official or someone from the Pentagon. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock Jr., at 41 years old and past the age for combat flying, had connections that reached the highest levels of power. During World War I, at just 17 years old, he joined the Lafayette Flying Corps, achieved 3 victories, was shot down, captured by Germans, and escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Germany by jumping off a moving train and walking over 100 miles to Switzerland. Between the wars, Hitchcock became one of the world's leading polo players and a successful investment banker. When World War II started, he volunteered for combat but was turned down due to his age. Instead, through his friend John Wynant, who served as the American ambassador to Britain, he secured a position as assistant air attaché at the embassy in London. Although it was meant to be a desk job, Hitchcock transformed it into a personal mission to revolutionize American fighter aviation. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew the Mustang for the first time and was impressed by its performance at low altitude, range, and handling capabilities. However, above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine struggled with power issues. Harker had an idea that seemed obvious in hindsight but was revolutionary at the time, replacing the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin featured a 2-stage supercharger that maintained performance up to 30,000 feet. It propelled the Spitfire and Lancaster bomber to new heights. If the same engine could be installed in the Mustang, it would create an unparalleled fighter aircraft. In June 1942, Rolls-Royce initiated the conversion of 5 Mustangs to Merlin power. The first converted plane took flight in October. The results were nothing short of remarkable. The Merlin-powered Mustang achieved a speed of 440 mph at 30,000 feet, which was an astounding 100 mph faster than its Allison counterpart. At that altitude, it could ascend to 20,000 feet in just 6 minutes. It also had the range to travel to Berlin and return. When Hitchcock reviewed the test results, he immediately recognized their significance. This aircraft had the potential to save the bomber offensive and win the air war. However, when Hitchcock presented these findings to Washington, the Army Air Forces showed no interest. The Mustang was still viewed as a British project. The United States was already committed to producing the P-47 and P-38. Pentagon officials were reluctant to alter production schedules for an untested hybrid design. This rejection left Hitchcock stunned. American bombers were being decimated due to a lack of effective escort fighters, yet the solution was right under their noses. Military bureaucracy seemed blind to reality, held captive by nationalistic preferences and institutional inertia. The testing center was focused solely on American designs with American engines, considering the Mustang with its British engine almost treasonous. Major General Oliver Eccles, who headed the Material Command at Wright Field, had already made up his mind that the P-47 would be the main fighter aircraft for the Army Air Forces and controlled procurement with an authoritative stance. However, Hitchcock refused to give up after surviving a German prison camp and crossing Switzerland on foot. Recognizing that official channels were not yielding results, he launched what his biographer described as a guerrilla campaign to compel the Army Air Forces to adopt the Merlin Mustang. To achieve this, he inundated Washington with performance data, organized flight demonstrations for influential acquaintances, hosted dinners where he engaged key military figures in private discussions, and even wrote directly to General Henry Arnold, bypassing the entire chain of command. Initially, Arnold dismissed Hitchcock's entreaties because the Army Air Forces had heavily invested in existing fighter planes. However, Hitchcock had an ace up his sleeve, his acquaintance with Robert Lovett, Assistant Secretary of War for Air, whom he knew from their service together during World War I. When Hitchcock flew to Washington in November 1942, he went straight to Lovett's office armed with test data from Britain, photographs of the Merlin Mustang, and performance charts demonstrating its superiority over all American fighters. Lovett immediately grasped the significance, as he had been monitoring bomber loss rates and understood that without long-range escorts, the strategic bombing campaign was failing. Arnold faced a critical situation head-on. The 8th Air Force was suffering heavy losses, making it impossible to sustain the bomber campaign any longer. They needed a long-range escort fighter or would have to halt daylight bombing operations. Under intense pressure from superiors and subordinates alike, Arnold finally gave in. In November 1942, he ordered the production of two 200 P-51B Mustangs equipped with Packard-built Merlin engines. North American Aviation was tasked with manufacturing these aircraft at facilities in Inglewood, California, and a new plant in Dallas, Texas. However, ordering the planes did not equate to getting them into action immediately. Production didn't start until June 1943, and the first P-51B arrived in England only in November of that year. By then, over 1,000 bombers had been lost, resulting in more than 10,000 casualties among aircrews. The delay came at a significant human cost. The technical hurdles involved in producing the Merlin-powered Mustang were immense. Packard Motor Company needed to retool its Detroit factories to manufacture the engines under license. All parts and specifications had to be adapted from British to American standards. Engineers discovered that Rolls-Royce craftsmen individually adjusted each engine during assembly, a process unfeasible for mass production. Therefore, Packard redesigned components for interchangeability while preserving performance levels. The first Packard-built Merlin, designated V1650, rolled off the production line in August 1942. This engine generated an impressive 490 horsepower at takeoff and sustained that power up to an altitude of 30,000 feet. When incorporated into the Mustang aircraft, it dramatically enhanced its performance capabilities. The maximum speed increased from 390 mph to 441 mph, while the service ceiling climbed from 31,000 to 42,000. Perhaps most crucially, this upgrade allowed the Mustang to engage in combat at altitudes typically used by bomber formations. North American aviation encountered significant production hurdles. The Inglewood, California facility was operating at full capacity, producing B-25 Mitchell bombers. To meet the demand for Mustangs, the company had to construct a new manufacturing plant in Dallas, Texas. Construction on this facility commenced in April 1943, and by August of that year, the first P-51C model rolled off the assembly line there. This was distinct from the earlier California-built P-51B model, although both versions were identical except for their production site. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force was suffering heavy casualties. During the summer and fall of 1943, bomber losses reached alarming levels. For instance, the Regensburg raid on August 17th resulted in the loss of 60 bombers, while another mission over Bremen on October 8th saw 30 bombers lost. On October 10th, an additional 30 bombers were destroyed. Crews faced grim odds, calculating their survival chances using cold statistics at prevailing casualty rates. A crew had only a 1 in 4 chance of completing their required 25 missions. Morale was severely compromised, and some aircrews outright refused to undertake further flights. The strategic bombing campaign was on the brink of collapse. The 354th Fighter Group became the first unit to receive P-51Bs powered by Merlin engines. Their base was located in Boxted, Essex. Prior to this, the pilots had been flying P-39 Airacobras, which were often referred to as the Flying Coffin due to their poor performance. When they saw their new Mustangs, they were astounded by the difference. The acceleration was remarkable, and it climbed like a rocket. At 25,000 feet, where the P-39 could barely operate, the Mustang was just beginning to reach its potential. The first escort mission with P-51Bs took place December 5, 1943, over Army, France. It was a brief mission within the range of P-47 Thunderbolts. Designed as a test for the new fighters, the Mustangs performed flawlessly. On December 13th, they escorted bombers to Kiel, Germany, which was about 400 miles from base. For the first time, American fighters were able to provide protection deep into German territory. On December 20th, they flew as far as Bremen. By January 7, 1944, the Mustangs had escorted bombers all the way to Lübeck, Hamburg, roughly 500 miles from England. The impact was immediate and significant. In October 1943, before the arrival of the Mustangs, the 8th Air Force lost 9% of its attacking bombers. By January 1944, with limited Mustang escort, losses had dropped to 6.3%. By February, as more Mustangs arrived, losses fell further to 3.5%. The bomber crews affectionately called the Mustangs their little friends. For the first time since the commencement of the bombing campaign, they had secure coverage all the way to their target and back. Mustang pilots swiftly adapted their strategies to enhance their combat efficiency. Instead of maintaining proximity to bomber formations, they would extend ahead and flank them, seeking out German fighters before any engagement could occur. Colonel Donald Blakesley from the 4th Fighter Group was instrumental in developing these proactive tactics. He encouraged his pilots to abandon defensive maneuvers and focus on aggressive action. Chase after German aircraft relentlessly, pursue them back to their airfields, and engage them during landing phases. Create an environment where they hesitate to take off due to fear of being shot down. The impact on the Luftwaffe was significant. On January 11, 1944, Major James Howard from the 354th Fighter Group defended a complete bomber formation solo. Operating separately from his squadron, Howard engaged in combat with 30 German fighters. He managed to shoot down 4 enemy planes and likely destroyed 2 more while damaging another pair. For an entire half hour, he stood as the sole fighter protecting the bombers. This heroic act earned him the Medal of Honor. Captain Duntile of the 4th Fighter Group was renowned as the Ace of Aces. Piloting his Mustang named Shangri, La Gentile achieved 21.8 confirmed aerial victories and destroyed 6 additional enemy aircraft on the ground. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, contributed significantly with 18 aerial kills. Together, they formed the most formidable fighter duo within the 8th Air Force. General Dwight D. Eisenhower praised Gentile's contributions by referring to him as a one-man air force. Major George Prey from the 357 Fighter Group holds the distinction of being the top scoring Mustang pilot during World War II. On August 6, 1944, despite battling a hangover from an earlier celebration, Prey shot down 6 Messerschmitt Bf 109s in just one mission while leading his squadron against a formation of 30 German fighters near Hamburg. In the brief but intense engagement, he managed to destroy 6 enemy planes and save numerous bombers under attack. Throughout his career, Prey would go on to shoot down 26.83 aircraft before tragically losing his life due to friendly fire from American anti-aircraft guns on Christmas Day in 1944. A significant turning point occurred on March 4, 1944, when American fighters made their first appearance over Berlin. A total of 68 Mustangs escorted a large formation consisting of 6660 B-7 and B-24 to the German capital. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. Hermann Göring, who led Germany's Luftwaffe at the time, later remarked that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost for Germany. The technical superiority of the Mustang was evident. With internal fuel and drop tanks, it could travel a distance of 300 miles. In comparison, even with maximum external fuel, the P-47 could only cover 600 miles. The Mustang's cruising speed reached 325 mph while using less fuel than what a P-47 required to maintain a pace of 250 mph. At an altitude of 25,000 feet, the Mustang was about 50 mph faster than a P-47 and nearly 70 mph quicker than a Messerschmitt Bf 9. Perhaps most importantly, the arrival of the Mustang fundamentally altered the nature of aerial combat. Prior to this point, American fighters had primarily been defensive in nature, tasked with protecting bombers from enemy attacks. The Mustangs were now offensive weapons. After completing escort missions, they would descend to lower altitudes and engage in ground strafing runs against German airfields, destroying parked aircraft on the ground. They also targeted German fighter planes attempting to land, catching them when their fuel and ammunition supplies were critically low. They would patrol over German training zones, shooting down both instructors and students before they became operational pilots. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more planes than it could replace. Even more critically, it was losing experienced pilots at a faster rate than new ones could be trained. During April and May of that year, the Luftwaffe lost 800 fighters and 600 pilots. The Mustang wasn't just safeguarding bombers, it was dismantling the Luftwaffe's capacity to fight effectively. German pilots who survived these encounters spoke with a mix of awe and dread about the Mustang. Major Wilhelm Guth from Jagdgeschwader 26 recalled, "We could no longer anticipate where American fighters would be. They were omnipresent. Above us, behind us, even waiting at our airfields. The Mustang had the range to pursue us anywhere. We had lost control of our own airspace." Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, who commanded German fighter forces, quickly grasped the significance. The Mustang was not merely another fighter aircraft, it was a strategic weapon that negated Germany's geographical advantages. For 3 years, the heart of Germany had been shielded by distance, which allowed Allied fighters to avoid reaching cities like Berlin and Munich or vital industrial areas such as the Ruhr Valley. German factories could produce weapons with relative safety, and training bases could prepare new pilots without interference. The Mustang shattered this sanctuary. Galland attempted to add German tactics in response to the Mustang threat. He instructed pilots to engage in combat only when they held numerical superiority. He strategically deployed fighters near critical targets, aiming to overpower enemy escorts with coordinated mass assaults. New tactical formations were devised to penetrate fighter screens effectively. Despite these efforts, nothing seemed to succeed. The Mustangs outmaneuvered them with their superior speed, overwhelming numbers, and relentless aggression. They operated in tight, knit groups that provided mutual protection, leaving no openings for the Germans. Technical advancements proved equally ineffective. Germany accelerated the development of jet fighters like the Messerschmitt 262 and Arado 234. Although these planes could match Mustangs in level flight speed, they were plagued by unreliability, limited range, and vulnerability during takeoff and landing phases. American pilots soon learned to monitor German airfields, targeting jets when they were most vulnerable. On October 7, 1944, Lieutenant Erbendrew from the 361st Fighter Group shot down 2 Messerschmitt 2D-62s in a single mission, demonstrating that even Germany's advanced aircraft were not invincible. Production capabilities also favored the Allies significantly. In 1944, North American Aviation produced over 700 Mustangs, while Germany managed to manufacture just 2 A-100 fighters of all types. The arithmetic reality was undeniable. For every German fighter destroyed, America could produce 2 replacements. For each German pilot lost, there were 3 ready and waiting in the wings. The Luftwaffe faced not only defeat but systematic annihilation. A dark humor emerged among German pilots as they grappled with their dire circumstances. The crew laughed and said that the role of the Luftwaffe involved serving as targets for American fighter planes. They dubbed themselves the Suicide Squadron due to their exceedingly short life expectancy, often measured in days or weeks at most. New arrivals from pilot training were referred to as lambs since they were aware these rookies would likely be killed soon. Those few pilots who managed to survive became increasingly resigned to their fate. Their motivation to fly stemmed primarily from a sense of duty rather than hope for victory. By June 6, 1944 D-Day, the Luftwaffe was capable of executing only 300 sorties over the Normandy invasion beaches, while Allied forces managed an impressive 14,600 sorties that day. The air superiority achieved on D-Day can be attributed largely to the effectiveness of the Mustang fighter aircraft. The numbers paint a clear picture. Prior to the arrival of Mustangs in 1943, American fighters claimed a kill ratio of 1 German fighter shot down for every 1.22 American planes lost. However, by early 1944, with increasing numbers of Mustangs in action, this ratio improved dramatically to 4 German aircraft destroyed for each Mustang loss incurred. By the war's conclusion, Mustang pilots had amassed an impressive tally of 4 90-50 enemy aircraft downed in aerial combat and another 431 destroyed on the ground during missions. Ground attack operations conducted by Mustangs were especially destructive. After escorting bombers to their targets, these fighters would descend to treetop level to seek out targets of opportunity. They systematically targeted railway locomotives, halting German supply trains in their tracks. They also engaged in strafing attacks on truck convoys, preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the front lines. Additionally, Mustangs launched assaults against airfields, destroying aircraft before they could take flight. On one mission dated April 16, 1944, Mustang pilots succeeded in annihilating 135 German planes while still parked on the ground. The introduction of the Mustang had a devastating effect on German pilot training programs. Prior to its arrival, new Luftwaffe recruits underwent an extensive 200-hour flight training regimen before entering combat situations. By early 1944, this figure had dropped to just 100 hours. Come summer of the same year, new pilots were being dispatched into battle with less than 50 hours of flying experience. They weren't seasoned aviators, they were essentially marked for death. A veteran German ace, Gunther R., who achieved 275 aerial victories and survived the conflict, described the grim reality. "We were sending young boys to certain death in aircraft they barely knew how to operate, let alone engage in combat with. They would take off one morning only to be shot down by midday. The Mustangs were waiting for them. Experienced pilots flying superior machines." This wasn't a fair fight, it was an execution. Compounding the issue was Germany's dwindling supply of aviation fuel. To conserve what little remained, pilot training programs were scaled back, focusing instead on maintaining combat operations. However, these missions were depleting pilots faster than they could be replenished, creating a vicious cycle. With fewer instructors and trainees available, the quality of flight instruction declined, leading to even greater losses. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was launching desperate, kamikaze-style attacks. Ella pilots from S-Commando Squadron received orders to crash into American bombers. essentially sacrificing themselves along with their planes in a futile attempt to destroy just one enemy aircraft. This radical and desperate strategy stemmed from their sense of powerlessness. The once formidable Luftwaffe had been reduced to kamikaze tactics due to its weakened state. Despite these extreme measures, the plan largely failed because Mustang escort fighters intercepted most of the ramming pilots before they could reach their targets. Tragically, the individual most instrumental in the Mustang's success would not witness its triumph. On April 18, 1944, Thomas Hitchcock was conducting a test flight near Salisbury, England, when his P-51 crashed, taking his life instantly. The official report suggested that he might have been attempting to push the aircraft's capabilities to their absolute limits at the time of the crash. Edgar, the designer behind the Mustang, received no formal recognition during the war. His contributions went unacknowledged in any wartime reports, and he was never awarded or promoted for his work. Post-war, Edgar continued designing aircraft for North American aviation, creating the F-86 Sabre jet that would dominate the skies over Korea. When reflecting on the Mustang years later, Schmood stated simply, "We built what they asked for. The British requested a cable aircraft, and that's exactly what was delivered." However, there is no official acknowledgement of the institutional resistance that almost doomed the Mustang's development. The Army Air Force's World War II history only mentions that the Mustang was initially developed for the British before being adopted by American forces, omitting any reference to the 2-year delay in its deployment. The bureaucratic hurdles faced during the plane's early stages and the fact that Wright Field overlooked the aircraft while bombers were suffering significant lossy tails are details have been left out of historical records. General Oliver Eccles, who had been a critic of the Mustang aircraft, received both promotion and accolades despite his earlier stance against it. He eventually retired as a major general with his reputation unblemished. However, those who flew combat missions understood the true impact of the Mustang. Colonel Donald Bully, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, remarked post-war, "The Mustang was instrumental in winning the air war over Europe. Without it, the invasion would not have been feasible. The bombers could not have continued their operations otherwise, and we would have faced defeat." Captain Robert Gohl from the 31st Fighter Group echoed these sentiments more bluntly. He stated that had it not been for the intervention of British officials and Tommy Hitchcock, the brass might have led to the unnecessary deaths of countless pilots. The broader lesson stemming from the Mustang's history isn't primarily about advancements in technology, but rather highlights a systemic flaw within institutions. The United States Army Air Forces had constructed its doctrine around self-sufficient bomber squadrons. When this approach faltered dramatically, the institution was unable to acknowledge and rectify its mistakes. It took an outsider like Hitchcock, who bypassed conventional channels, to bring about necessary changes. Similarly, it required a foreign ally, Britain, to recognize the Mustang's capabilities when domestic authorities overlooked them. The consequences of institutional inertia were tragic, with thousands of unnecessary deaths occurring between October 1943 and March 1944, when Mustangs began escorting bombers in significant numbers. Approximately 2,000 American airmen lost their lives or fell into enemy hands during this period when the Mustang could have provided vital protection. These figures represent far more than just numerical data. They are individual lives cut short. These were young men with families and futures that were tragically cut short due to the narrow-mindedness of bureaucrats at Wright Field. Each B-17 carried 10 crew members, including a pilot and co-pilot who had just completed flight training. There was also a bombardier trained for months to drop bombs accurately from 25,000 feet, and a navigator skilled in finding targets through clouds and flak using only a compass and stopwatch. 6 gunners, many of them still teenagers, manned the .50 caliber machine guns meant to protect the bomber but often failed to do so. When a B-7 went down, 10 families received telegrams and 10 mothers mourned the loss of their sons' dreams over Germany. North American Aviation manufactured 15 586 Mustangs during World War II, serving in every theater with all Allied air forces. After the war, they continued to fly in Korea during the Israeli War of Independence and in numerous other conflicts until the Dominican Air Force retired its last military Mustangs in 1984. Today, approximately 300 Mustangs still exist, half of which are still flying. These planes are preserved not as weapons, but as reminders of a past that could have been very different. In the Pacific Theater, while Mustangs arrived late, they quickly demonstrated their dominance. Based on IWIMA data, Mustangs escorted B-29 Superfortresses to Japan on a 1,500-mile round trips. They engaged Japanese fighters in combat and targeted airfields and shipping as well. On April 7, 1945, Mustang shot down 21 Japanese aircraft without losing a single one. The Japanese, like the Germans before them, found their airspace transformed into hunting grounds for American fighters. These long-range missions over the Pacific pushed the Mustang to its operational limits. Pilots conducted 7-hour missions from cramped cockpits, meticulously monitoring fuel usage. Even a single gallon consumed too much on the outbound flight could result in an ocean landing upon return. Precision navigation was essential. A mere 1-degree error over 1,500 meters of water would cause them to miss the small island of Iwima entirely. Despite these challenges, they persisted day after day, extending American air power to Japanese territory. By 1950, when the Korean War broke out, the Mustang was deemed obsolete. Although jets had taken over the fighter role, F-80 Shooting Star jets lacked the necessary range and loiter time for close air support missions. Consequently, the F-51 Mustang was called back into service. Operating from rough airstrips in Korea, these aircraft provided crucial support to United Nations ground troops. They could deliver rockets, bombs, and napalm with precision, lingering over battlefields for extended periods. The South African Air Force flew the Mustang's final combat missions in Korea during January 1953, marking a fitting conclusion. This plane, which was initially overlooked and nearly discarded, outlasted its critics and competitors. It served longer, covered greater distances, and eliminated more enemies than any other American fighter of its era. The Mustang's success did not stem from the system in place. It triumphed despite bureaucratic resistance, institutional bias, and deliberate ignorance. Its exceptional design by a German immigrant, funded by a British commission when all else failed, and championed by a polo-playing former fighter pilot who refused to accept defeat, made it possible. In 1943, General Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, was asked by Hermann Göring what he needed to win the air war. Galland's response, "Give me Mustangs." His sarcasm to fundamental truth: the Mustang wasn't merely the finest American fighter or even the top Allied aircraft. It stood as the preeminent fighter of all time. Yet it nearly never materialized at all. The most compelling statistic isn't the tally of German planes downed or bombers protected. It's this: during October 1943 through May 1944, when Mustangs were entering service, the loss rate for 8th Air Force bombers plummeted from 9.1% to 2.7%. That reduction of 6.4% translated into hundreds of saved bombers and thousands of preserved lives. These were men who returned home due to the timely arrival of the Mustang. They would have perished had bureaucratic delays prevailed. James Kindleberger passed away in 1962, with his funeral drawing a large contingent of former bomber pilots. Their attendance was not out of respect for an aircraft company executive, but because his plane had safeguarded their lives. One such attendee, Medal of Honor recipient William Lely, who flew the B-7, remarked during the service, "Every time I see a Mustang, I remember the comrades who came home thanks to that airplane. And I recall those friends who never made it back because it was too late for them." The P-51 Mustang revolutionized aerial combat over Europe and paved the way for the D-Day invasion. It saved countless Allied lives, but its greatest legacy lay not in what it accomplished, but in the hope and survival it represented. The victory of ingenuity over red tape, of effectiveness over political maneuvering, of outcomes over rules. It demonstrated that sometimes the most potent tool is one that isn't sanctioned by the system. Often, the greatest triumphs are achieved not in battlefields, but in boardrooms and hallways, where choices are made or dodged, where aircraft orders are accepted or overlooked, where conflicts are decided before they even begin. If you found this narrative compelling, please consider liking this video to help us share more neglected stories from World War II. Subscribe to stay informed about these hidden histories. Each tale is significant and deserves remembrance. We would love to hear your thoughts below about you are viewing from. Our community ranges from Texas to Tasmania, encompassing veterans and history buffs alike. You are part of a special network here. Thank you for watching and helping keep these stories alive.